Funding for the Pause for Pride series in this production of Folks was provided by a grant from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Coming up today on Folks, a profile of sociologist, writer, and philosopher W.E.B. Du Bois. You'll also have a rare personal look at the man through the eyes of his granddaughter, Bois Williams, on today's Pause for Pride. Also, Edna Jordan-Smith of the Afro-Louisiana Historical Society tells how to begin researching your own family roots, all on today's edition of Folks. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Folks. I'm Sonya Masingale. We're continuing our exclusive Black History Month series, Pause for Pride, and it's truly a family affair today with a profile of the African-American man who is considered by many to be one of the American fathers of the science of sociology, W.E.B. Du Bois. But this Pause for Pride feature is different from most profiles of dead heroes. Bois Williams, the granddaughter of the legendary Du Bois, has made her home in New Orleans, Louisiana. Today, she helps breathe some life into the memory of her grandfather, allowing us a personal look at the private W.E.B. Du Bois. William Edward Burkhardt Du Bois was born in 1868. His career as sociologist, writer, philosopher, poet, and spokesman for African Americans spans over 70 years. Because he began researching and writing about African Americans using scientific techniques before sociology was considered a science, he is known as one of the fathers of American sociology. After receiving his bachelor's degree from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, he went on to study at Harvard and subsequently achieved his master's and doctorate degrees. He also studied for 2 years at the University of Berlin, all before the dawn of the 20th century. Du Bois published dozens of books, including several works of fiction and autobiographies. He also wrote hundreds of articles. Du Bois is perhaps most famous for The Souls of Black Folk, essay and sketches published in 1903, a book that stated, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." Du Bois is credited with being a principal figure involved with the beginning of an organized civil rights movement. He established, along with 29 other individuals, a conference which was called the Niagara Movement, an organization that evolved into the NAACP. Around this time, Booker T. Washington was the most outspoken spokesman for African Americans. Washington's ideas seemed radically different from Du Bois, and there began a rivalry that spanned several decades. The talented tenth is another of Du Bois's theories. He believed that a black aristocracy could be created by formally educating 10% of the race, thereby creating an elite group of leaders for blacks who would then develop realistic and viable alternatives to the white man's exploitation of the black working class. Around the time of World War I, Du Bois became editor-in-chief of The Crisis, the official magazine of the NAACP. The Crisis was a unique publication that included opinion columns, information on black schools, women's affairs, and coverage of black sports. Du Bois resigned from The Crisis in 1934. Du Bois continued to write, study, lecture, and travel. He received the gold medal of the International Lenin Prize in Moscow, 1959. Eventually, Du Bois declared himself a communist and was even jailed briefly during the McCarthy era for failing to register as a foreign agent with the U.S. government. He even ran for public office on the American Labor Party ticket. In 1961, despairing that African Americans would ever achieve equality in America, he moved to Accra, Ghana, in Africa, which would be his final home. He died there 2 years later at the age of 95, leaving the world a wealth of scientific study, new thoughts, and directions. Some consider him one, if not the greatest mind of African America.
Well, the first thing I would think, if he were here actually involved, he was an extremely modest person, and he would totally deny, that he was the greatest anything. I certainly think he was among the most incisive thinkers of his century. He was a man certainly far ahead of himself. He was always in the vanguard, if not even beyond that. But he never thought of himself in that sort of lofty position. He thought of himself as a black man who desired very, very strongly, was very passionate about helping his people, himself, his people, his family, all one. His people were his family, and I just happen also to be one of his family too. So I know of his great desire. I think for a long time he didn't believe that he was doing all that he needed to do. He was very shy, he was very modest, and he struggled. You know, he really struggled and tried and felt, gosh, there must be something more than I can do.
Bois Williams is the only grandchild of W.E.B. Du Bois. She lives now in New Orleans, Louisiana, and teaches psychology at Xavier University. Her knowledge of the great Dr. Du Bois is very special, since he was her principal father figure.
Obviously, hindsight is a wonderful thing, and looking back, we can see that he had made some really substantive contributions. He was a wonderful writer. I remember being in an airport in New York once, and there was some lady saying that I bet he's a scientist or something of this sort, and I happened to be sitting next to her, and she said, would I go over and ask him, you know, what he did? She didn't think that I knew him. And so I did, as if I were a stranger. And he said, well, some people he was a social scientist, so he said some people think that I'm not as scientific as I need to be. Other people think I'm not a scientist at all. And I will leave it up to the people to decide. So I trotted back with the message, and then later on told the lady that I was his granddaughter, and she was saying then, what does he think of himself? And he thought of himself as a teacher. That was what was most satisfying for him. That was what made his toes curl up, if you will, or gave him the kind of satisfaction that he could admit to. The rest of it, all the hoopla, in sort of his way of saying it, all the hoopla was window dressing. Okay, he did admit to being a writer also.
W.E.B. Du Bois married Nina Gomer. They produced one male child who died in infancy, an event that affected Du Bois and his wife deeply and is mentioned in his autobiographies. Nina and Du Bois later produced Yolande, Du Bois Williams' mother by her second marriage. Yolande first married the eminent writer Countee Cullen, a close friend of Du Bois and a key figure in the Harlem Renaissance movement. Du Bois was bitterly disappointed when that marriage ended in annulment. Here is a letter from Du Bois to Cullen at that time. Yolande went on to remarry and to produce Du Bois Williams. The family remained close and loving.
Strange enough, we had a very small family. My grandfather was the only male. It never occurred to him that because the rest of his family, wife, daughter, granddaughter, were females, that we should want for any less than he. And it never got translated into anything except find out what you want to do, what you do best, and do it. And this was very much brought out in a letter that he wrote to my son, who was the first male person in the family since his son died in childhood, in infancy. And so it made quite an impression on him to have this first great-grandson. And on the occasion of his 90th birthday, my son was born Christmas Day, and his 90th birthday was the following February, so I had this little infant in my lap. He delivered this very articulate, very moving letter which said, in essence, work is what it's all about. Find out what you want to do.
What was it like growing up with W.E.B. Du Bois as the main father figure in your life?
I was the rebel. I did not want to grow up in his shadow. I totally refused to do anything vocationally that he wanted, even might mention at the breakfast table that I do, whatever that was. I was going to go 180 degrees in the other direction. But something around my freshman year at Fisk, instead of going, I did say that I would look into sociology, which was, of course, his field. By the by, his field was not a field when he started. He got his PhD in history and civics and developed the scientific approach to sociology. So I said, well, I'd look into it and I'd, give it a whirl. But in my heart of hearts, I didn't know the words, but I was thinking I wanted to have a more personal, more individual look at people and interaction with people. Grandpa was a very, very complex person. I lived in a home with people in my living room who were also considered great, and almost all of them were unbelievably complex. First of all, Grandpa was not a permissive parent, not to my mother or to me. He had very strong values and very strong points of view. But I got a very subtle message early on that he did not necessarily want for me to swallow all of this hook, line, and sinker. He wanted me to make up my mind, develop my mind and my thinking and my feelings about things. Where my mother was a little more submissive and passive and conforming, that was the way she was naturally. I still got the feeling that he valued the little rebelliousness, the little non-conformity, the little idiosyncrasies. Grandpa was extremely patient. I would ask him a question like you have asked me one question. He might go on for 3 or 4 weeks with the answer. You think my answer's so long.
Du Bois's first marriage spanned over 50 years until Nina's death. Williams reflects now on her grandparents' relationship.
Unfortunately, with grandparents, they don't have the kind of energy left that people who are younger have. So he and my grandmother, by the time I got to be a teenager, were worn to a frazzle. Believe me, I was a handful. Not a bad kid, just very curious, very active, into things, mischievous, curious, and it takes energy to deal with this kind of child. So he really, considering everything, did a really marvelous job.
Well, being a kid,
ask me about my grandmother.
Tell me about, I want to know about your grandmother, Nina.
Yes, her name is Nina Gomer Dubois, and she was probably about 4 feet 9 1/2. Never got to 100 pounds in her life. It's just the tiniest lady, with more energy and more spunk and just more get up and go than you could possibly imagine. But we always had a very formal relationship, even in the home. I always heard my grandfather called Dr. Dubois. Everybody called him Dr. Dubois. If the doctor was left off, I answered. You see, so it had to be Dr. Dubois. If they said Dubois, that's me, right? I inadvertently looked over my grandmother's shoulder one day while she was writing her weekly letter to my grandfather. No matter where he was or what the circumstances were, these letters went out like clockwork. And she would tell him things, that had happened and what I had done and what my mother had done and the weekly budget and the whole schmear. Well, I really wasn't, intending to look. I was just standing there, and I looked down and I saw Dear Willie.
What was his legacy to you? You have his name. You absorbed lots of his philosophy. You were exposed to some of the greatest minds in the world. You had a good life, but what was his legacy to you?
This sounds possibly overly simplistic, but I think the ability to think for myself And that encompasses an awful lot of things. It means a certain degree of self-esteem, self-worth, self-confidence. It means the ability to question even those who are supposed to be authoritative. Like the New York Times, we had a little tete-a-tete about that once. He said even the New York Times is not always an authority. He was standing in a little town in the Soviet Union, and the New York Times said there was blood running in the streets. And he said, it was Sunday. People were going to church. It was calm, cool. There was no upheaval, no conflict. So these are little things, you know, that kind of stuck with me, that gave me the perspective, the gall, if you will, to question everything, and then to come to conclusions based on rational, not always objective, but certainly rational thinking. And I have a tremendous belief in and love for people.
Bois Williams is working on a biography of Dr. Dubois, and we're all looking forward to its publication and wish her the best of luck. Even if your family isn't famous, it can still be an adventure uncovering your family's roots. In our final feature for today, former librarian Edna Jordan-Smith of Baton Rouge tells us how to get started.
During the 40s, neighbors started moving away, going to New York or Philadelphia, and playmates leaving, not seeing them anymore. so many years later, it created a real sincere interest in knowing what happened to those people. And then after hearing about a family whose daughter married a relative by not knowing, it struck me that this could happen to anybody. And people need to do something about it. Not only that, after getting older, realizing what had actually happened to us as a people, being sold from plantation to plantation, from state to state, throughout the slave states, that was a big interest. Who are these people? They are us, and we don't know anything about them.
Edna Jordan-Smith is founder and president of the Afro-Louisiana Historical and Genealogical Society, Incorporated, a society dedicated to research in Afro-Louisiana history and culture. The society represents a personal quest for Smith, who began by taking an interest in her own family background.
Many of us don't know our people, don't know anything about our grandparents or great-grandparents, and most of us, as a people, as I said, cannot really go beyond the fourth generation, and some can't go that far. And I feel that I really got into it because I realized there are so many people who don't realize that much of that information they think is lost is not lost. It just takes time to get it. It takes know-how to get it. It takes interest, courage, a desire to really want to know. That's all it takes. And of course, we work. We have to work. Many people feel, well, I would love to do it, but I just don't have the time. But there is something you can do. You can start searching within the home. You can start talking to older relatives or older neighbors. You can do that, put it down.
Smith says that family members are the first and primary source of information about family history and a good place to begin research of family roots. But if there are no older family members around to help begin a search, there are other resources as well.
Well, I would suggest, Sonya, that they would try the census, your census records. The 1870 records would be the first time that you would find black people in them by name. And you can find the census records really at the Centroplex Library. They're there. You could try the State Library. You could try LSU's library. That is Middleton Library. And once you get over seeing those people's names listed there, you got to really kind of take your breath and get over it. It's just like somebody getting religion, you know. You're so excited until you got to tell everybody about it. You saw your great-grandmother's name in the census, or your great-grandfather. And the reason I mentioned the census, not only will the name be there, but that whole family that was in that household is there. And if you go back to 1870, it would list the head of the household. If it's the husband, it would list his name, his age, where he was born, and many times the 1870s you would find some of them would list Africa, some would list North Carolina, South Carolina, Kentucky, all of the slave states more than likely you would find if you go through these records. And therefore the census is really giving you more information than you thought you could have found. Then beneath the father's name would be his wife, her age, and it also tells if they could read or write. The occupation is there. Under the mother, you would find all the children and their ages.
Smith also says that courthouses are excellent tools for researching family members. Death and marriage certificates such as these can reveal important information.
In addition to the courthouses and the Centroplex Library, wherever you can find the census and things of that nature, if you get into plantation life and owners who own these people, I would advise you your next step would be Hill Memorial. library out at LSU. That's the special collections. There they house records, personal records of plantation owners from the lower Mississippi Valley through Louisiana. Now, they may not have them all. It had to, you know, families had to give these records, the state or whatever, they may have come by them, but there are many there. And diaries, personal letters, slave transactions. It was just a joy to look through Wakefield plantation records. There are so many records there dealing with that Sterling family. And once you ask about those records, they have a way to get them. You have to sign them out. They're precious documents.
Researching family history can be time-consuming, but the rewards are well worth the effort.
Really, roots give you stamina. The roots of anything holds it up. It gives you something to be proud of. It gives you knowledge about what went on. It gives you knowledge about people who are the cause of your being here. It lets you know that they too had a life. They too had something to do with your being who you are. And these people, they experienced things that you do today. Some of them experienced harsher things than you did and than you do today. But if you really had a pride in your ancestry, you'd want to know what they experienced. And that's where the pride really develops, when you find out what went on. Could I have taken it? Could I have just weathered the storms that they did? If you were to go in and just start searching, you'll find more things. You can even find marriage license of people back as far as the 1860s, because I have my grandmother's marriage license. She married right here in Baton Rouge in 1869, and the courthouse has it, but I didn't know it existed until I started really looking.
Well, that's all for today. Thanks for joining us, and be sure to tune in next week for another edition of Folks. Bye-bye. Funding for the Pause for Pride series in this production of Folks was provided by a grant from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities.